So my three key learnings or key bullet points of the last 10 years are: number one, the infinite power of presence; number two, the pointlessness of attaching to outcomes; and number three, the power of better relating. Um,
And I think let's start with the first one. And I really want to dive into all three of them, really. But let's see if we have the time. But the infinite power of presence. I think we've all felt it here in the interview that you're definitely here, not doing other things and powered up. But I'd love to hear why you're saying this is so important for you.
so I think we spend most of our lives in our heads, either thinking about the past or the future. What should I have done differently? Did I upset my colleague? Or in the future, which is I have this and that and that to do, and we're constantly talking to the voice in our head is talking to us, and it's constantly stressing us out or making us hopeful or whatever it may be. And because we're either in the past or the future, we're not really ever there in the nature of the experience that presents itself to us. And the costs of that are infinite and enormous. So, to give you an example, maybe your little girl is coming home from school and she's upset, but you're not feeling her because you're thinking about that podcast you have to record tonight. Okay, what's the cost of that loss? Now, you can then expand that and to say that to be present is to give yourself the opportunity to experience the infinite beauty of the world and of your own life in it. So when you boil it all down, it's like savoring coffee. It's like you go to a restaurant and you allow the taste to blossom in your mouth instead of eating. And then you realize that, oh my God, if I'm allowing myself, you can do it right now. You can say, let me be fully present to the fact that the few of us here on this podcast present to each other, and that we see each other as human beings, and that we have our history, and that it brought us all here. And can we celebrate that for a minute and ourselves in the process? Okay, was that a richer moment than just showing up and thinking about how we're going to edit the podcast? Probably, right? So that's what I call the infinite power of presence. And it is something I experienced gradually more intensely. And then there is a moment where it's almost like a breakthrough moment when you feel everything around you all at the same time. And it is beautiful. And it happened to me last July. And it kind of is like opening a door to a different way of being with yourself and people around you. It doesn't mean you're there all the time. Sometimes I'm like stressed and off my head, and but it's something that you can try and go back to because it makes things richer.
Could I ask you, Fred? You brought up something earlier in this chat about your empathy towards founders, right? And as you said, where are you feeling it? You're feeling like just up here, the anxiousness. You're about to puke, right? And sometimes you find yourself interacting with people who are at that level of stress and anxiety because they're worried about their business, they're trying to build it. So what you said right now kind of goes the opposite route of thinking, okay, if you just stop and focus on the presence and on the now, maybe that's a good way to deal with that anxiousness. But myself, I have a bit that profile, right? And it's incredibly hard as an individual, right, to go through that process, right? So I am feeling incredibly anxious, incredibly nervous. The world is going to end, everything is an issue, right? And then kind of forcing yourself to kind of stop, take a breather, forcing yourself to kind of stop, take a breather, and put yourself in that position. Okay, I'm here now. Let me focus on what's around me. Let me be present, right? How do you try and help founders and also colleagues, right, and even employees with kind of keeping present, staying present, and being there?
So if the foundation is trust, trust allows for some form of vulnerability, which is a very overused word, but let's use it very practically. You can pause with a founder and go, hey, how much I detect fear in your system. How much fear are you feeling? And then the person will go, oh, fuck, I'm scared. Right. And they were like, okay, good. All right. Well, now it's on the table. By the way, expressing it, feelings don't last very long, right? This is what neuroscience tells us. They actually, being sad, for example, doesn't last very long. So we're like, okay, we've expressed the fear. Can we find out where it's from? Well, it's fear of failure. I was like, okay, well, let's work through. You can't deny fear. The SWAT teams will tell you you have to accept your fear. What does accepting your fear mean? Well, what's fear do you have? Failure. How bad is failure really? You have to fire people. They're all competent. They'll find new jobs. You have to go and talk to your seed investors and your friends and family and tell them you lost their money. And, you may have to go live with your mom. Okay. So now we've listed the worst outcomes. And like, is any of this threaten your existence or your place within the world? Or it might threaten your view of yourself for a bit, but that's for a bit of therapy work. And then you're like, you know what? Okay, I can live with the worst outcomes. Like, okay, good. So now we're back in a place where we can talk about what we can actually do. So this is a very practical example. The samurai, I always say, can I mention the way of the samurai? So there are two things I love from samurais. Samurais are not great examples because they used to kill people for a living, but they did have some things to teach us. One is they would meditate upon their own death 1,000 times before going to battle. The very Japanese thing to go meditate 1,000 times. But the idea was, if you can envisage your own death, by the time you get to the battlefield, everybody else is freaking out because they're like, I want to see my kids tonight. And the samurai is there ready with whatever outcome is going to come. As a result, his probability of survival is a lot higher, and his probability of being effective in the field is a lot higher. So meditate on your own death 1,000 times, could be your startup or you, is useful. And then the other thing with the samurai is economy of movement. Parry, strike, the person's dead. And then you see Errol Flynn with his sword and going like this, the kind of typical, the musketeers, and the Japanese in the meantime would have one hit of the sword and you'd be dead. So this is all about impact. It's like, what is the movement that I can take that has maximum impact? And if I've thought about it, so instead of being busy, I'm impactful. So, I like the way of the samurai for these two things, which I try and apply to my own life for sure.
So did you meditate on the failure of Stride before you started Stride? Or do you meditate on the failure of Stride?
I will go a little bit further than that. What is the meaning of life? We don't know. How far can you push present? Can you be present at the moment of your own death? In other words, if you think about the act of dying or the moment of dying, could it be just another moment of present? If you can get to that, then you're in the zone where you can take anything. So in that context, sure, I've meditated about the failure of Stride, no problemo.
I like that. So I actually, we've danced a bit around the topic of both being present, but also the power of relating better, which is the third one that you mentioned. And I think those two go very much hand in hand. I know, at least for me, it really does, because I always say that me being in the presence is very much connected to the power with which I relate to the core people that are in my life. But I'm curious to hear how you think about the power of relating better, and if you see it connected to being present in your life as well.
So if we think about personal work, and personal work being the journey of discovering yourself and how you relate to the world and others, a lot of people don't want to do it because it's uncomfortable and it opens up old wounds and all that. And it can be quite anxiety inducing. The beauty of personal work, though, is that over time you understand yourself, the stories you tell yourself about the world, others, and how you show up better and better and better. And there are two gifts from personal work. The number one is freedom, which is because freedom of social conditioning, family conditioning, trauma, etc. Like, if you really want to understand your place in the world and how the world works, personal work is a prerequisite for me, because now you're going to open the door to understanding how shit really works. Now, don't think you do, because if you start kidding yourself, you're in trouble, but you'll get closer to the truth and you'll get closer to freedom. The second thing is better relating. And better relating relies on understanding yourself equally and others, right? So if we have a difficult conversation, you're going to be emotionally in a complicated zone, and I will be emotionally in a complicated zone. And if I can hold awareness of both of us, my boundaries, my reactions, and then your emotional state, and etc. If I can hold us both in that space, now we have a chance of actually having a deeply meaningful conversation about something that's complicated for both of us and where we can get closer. And the objective, of course, is to build companions for life, friends, founders, partners, etc., that we can live our lives with, and where these are relationships where we can relax, where we are in full trust, where we are safe, where we can be vulnerable. And you can't really do that without developing your ability to relate. Because what we do most of the time, we're like, this person's like this, or this person hurt me, or this person, and you're like, actually, anything you get triggered by is a reflection of something inside yourself you haven't worked on. Like, start with that, but it was very empowering.
Fred, I have to ask you, because you are recognized as one of the best investors in Europe. And I think that people who have listened to this episode is likely to also think, this guy's one of the most philosophical, almost spiritual guys I've also heard. I'm curious to hear, how much do you leverage everything we hear here with, in your relationships to founders, and how you work with founders, and how you try and get founders to grow themselves as both as a founder, but also as executive teams?
The way in which I interact with founders is primarily around what I consider to be my highest impact zones, and it is primarily around core strategy. Because designing business models, designing pricing, designing go-to-market methods, and linking it all together. The difficulty is always to take product, pricing, people, technical capacities of the team, and bring it all together. That remains my zone of genius. That's where I'm best at, right? And that usually is the highest value thing that I can do with founders. So that honestly is where I tend to live. All the personal work is unbelievably useful in terms of enhancing the quality of these conversations, again, because you're present to the other person. I have not to date brought that into a specific work around coaching, etc. You know why? Because I don't think that's my highest impact area. And, in my choice of where I deploy my energy, I'm focused on the highest impact thing I can do. So today I'm trying to be in my zone of genius and trying to help founders in the limited way that I can with the thing that I do best.
And then let me flip the question to firm building, because it's one thing, okay, you've got very limited time with founders. You want to make sure that you're spending that time in the best way, and you don't want to be pushing shamanism on a founder, and then the founder thinks that he has to do that because his investors said so. But we're all building firms here, and we're all trying to build a culture. And you being the founder of Stride, I'm sure you're also spending quite some time with your partners and your team, thinking about how do you grow as a team and as individuals.
So the internal culture of venture firms is incredibly important in my mind. Why? Because the core product of a venture capital organization is our decision-making engine. The decision-making engine most of the time tends to be a battle of influence between A, B, and C. And depending on your level of seniority, how much of an alpha you are, or how eloquent you are, or something, you're going to win the day. So most venture partnerships are structured as this heavy debate environment. So step number one for me is to say, okay, can we move to systems thinking? And it's quite inspired by Ray Dalio and the idea of meritocracy at Bridgewater. But can we move away from this opinion-based discussion to systems thinking? Does this fundamentally have venture scalability? Does this have the kind of amplitude we need to return the fund? Is this executable in terms of the funding pathway and what we have in the team? And we try and break it down into just understanding whether the kind of risk-return profile we're taking is adequate for the firm, rather than is it going to work, is it not going to work? Because if I knew if it's going to work, not going to work, I'd be an absolute genius. We don't know. So it's like, well, is it the right kind of risk? And are we backing the right kind of people? So we flip that. I would say if the quality of our discussions was good enough, the decision should emerge Like you wouldn't even need to make it. It would be obvious to everybody because the discussion was so good that we'd be nodding our head going, this one should be done or it shouldn't be done. And if you have a debate about an aspect of the business model where somebody believes in it strongly, which happens often, somebody doesn't, you still have such a quality debate that you'd be, but I understand why you want to do it and it makes sense. I just have a different view of the world on that. So that's number one, is decision-making engine. And then number two is back to trust. Partnerships are complicated animals because trust is fragile and needs to be rebuilt time and time again. And people have complicated relationships with money. Money usually is the thing that destroys the trust inside venture organizations. So when I started with Harry, we were like, hey, equal economics on the carry side. We paid ourselves different amounts of cash because I have 3 kids in private school and blah. But we were equal econ on the carry side. People thought I lost my mind. I'm like, you don't understand. We're aligned on the incentives. This is not something we ever need to talk about. And now we can just go win in the market, and whoever generates value, venture funds make people wealthy anyway. It's like, who cares? And so I think people get stuck in these debates of their relative worth and contribution. The reality is, I don't know. Lena's, whatever age she is, I've never asked her. She's probably around under 30 or something. It's like, okay, well, she might be the biggest contributor in 5 years' time. How on earth should I know? So, incentivize people in the right way, focus on culture deeply, and make sure your decision-making engine is protected. Now, the tension is you're trying to build a championship team, not a family. So you still also at the same time want to go, hey, we're trying to build a world-class group of people. So, and venture is an interesting business because none of it is intellectually that complicated. Like, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to assess an investment, right? But it's the combination of things, because it's like, oh, I need to be a networker. I need to know how to source. I need to know how to convince somebody to take my money. I need to be able to assess an investment. I need to be able to make an investment decision and have the kind of nose at some point that it's going to work. Then I need to be a board member. Then I need to be able to run a firm. Then I need to be able to raise money from LPs. And in all that, I need empathy, strategic thinking, rigor. So the problem with venture is not the specific one skill that you can pick out, it's the holistic nature of the job. And so I have found, for me, the hardest thing is to build a championship team. It's difficult. I'm very humble about it because it is an ongoing learning process.